Okay, now we're moving on to the first substantive part of our course, dealing with international monetary relations. And this chapter is one that provides you a very brief introduction to the workings both of the IMF as well as a reference to a number of other global financial institutions. The IMF, or International Monetary Fund, as you know, was established by the conference at Bretton Woods in 1944, together with the World Bank. And we will see that it plays the central role in terms of international monetary relations. Okay, so before we dive into the intricacies of the IMF, a few words on the general issues raised by this part of our program. And first, we have this idea of money. Now, money is an abstraction, um, as Professor Collins points out in his book. Professor David Collins, in his book *The Foundations of International Economic Law*, in the chapter applying to regarding the IMF, he points out that, well, law is that money is an abstraction, so is language, and ultimately the very idea of God is also an abstraction. The fact that money is an abstraction has several implications, as we're going to see. The reason why money is used, and you'll be familiar with this through your previous education, is that it provides you with a measure of value. It allows you to translate the value of, say, your work into something that can be exchanged, can be used to determine a value of exchange. So money, by providing this a measure of this measure of value, allows us to exchange very different things like labor, goods, and services, and it provides for a more efficient means of exchange than barter. You know, if I'm willing to work cleaning the windows in your house in exchange for, say, a bottle of milk, it really depends on whether or not you find it useful that, you know, I wash the windows at your house. And it also depends on whether or not you have milk available to give it to me. So money eliminates that, because then money is neutral in the sense that you don't need to be a milk producer. Okay, in order to hire me, you can just give me money and then I'll go and buy milk, which is what I wanted to do after all. Money also provides us with a reserve of value. So it allows value to be transferred through time. It allows the preservation of this value through time, particularly when we're dealing with non-perishable money. We still find often, you know, major archaeological treasures containing gold and other precious metals. And in addition to the historical value, there's also an intrinsic value in the simple quantity of gold. So whenever people were in times of trouble, they would keep gold or silver or another metal or diamonds, whatever means of exchange was used at the time. Now, again, this requires what I think is an element of faith. And in the sense that if you take a banknote, you know, the reason why a banknote of 20 euros provides you with a notion of value, and you think, okay, in this banknote I have a reserve of 20 euros, is mostly a matter of faith. You believe that everyone else also believes that that piece of paper is worth 20 euros, and we all have an idea of just about what 20 euros might be good for, what you can pay with 20 euros. But again, it is an abstraction. And you only have this faith, this trust in money, so long as the entity that is behind the money is one where you can deposit your trust. If you think, for instance, of international currency reserves, which play a major role in international economic relations, for instance, the US dollar tends to be a stronger currency for various historical reasons. But if you compare it with the euro, particularly up until the euro crisis in 2011, the euro was essentially something very new because it was not a currency issued by a state, it was a currency issued by an association of states. Now, if this association was to unravel, if it was dissolved, then the euro would no longer have any value. Whereas if you think of US dollars, you tend to have the expectation that the United States will be around for at least some decades. And so you have a stronger trust in the value of the US dollar than in the value of, say, the euro. So it's trying to, okay, get someone here. All right. So that was just to say that, oops, okay. Just to say that, to explain the idea that this is an abstraction and that the value of money is connected to other aspects of our beliefs. Okay, now moving on, when we think of money in international economic law, since money is typically issued by states, it's inevitable to think of the idea of monetary sovereignty. Now, monetary sovereignty was sort of the building block for the foundation for international monetary law. So this has been described by the Permanent Court of International Justice in the Serbian and Brazilian loans case decided in 1929, that this is a basic attribute of sovereignty. So there's a generally accepted principle that a state is entitled to regulate its own currency. So adapting it to modern times, you would think that, well, the Eurozone is entitled to regulate the euro as the United States government is entitled to regulate the dollar, etc., etc. You can think of any international currency. So this view as a building block tends to focus on the idea of the sovereign and of the power to create money as a sovereign power. However, the creation of money, because it is used in international exchange, is also a matter for international law, as we're going to see in this part of our course. Now, so the first thing is, okay, so what does this monetary sovereignty, what does it translate into? And one of the foremost experts in this area, Professor Jose Lastra, has sort of provides a very neat table of the sort of elements that compose this sovereignty notion of monetary sovereignty. So it's the power to issue notes and coins. It's the power to regulate money. How can you use money? Which type of means of payment you are, as a business forced to accept, which ones you cannot accept. The power to control money supply and interest rates, very important policy, monetary policy. The power to control the exchange rate. So under what terms can your currency be exchanged with the currency of another state, and also to determine the exchange regime, so-called exchange rate policy, and also the power to impose exchange and capital controls. And as we're going to see, it means that if you have the power to impose exchange and capital controls, you have indirectly the power to control trade. Why? Because typically, whenever you trade, with the exception of barter. Barter is a direct exchange. So I exchange, say, bananas for oil. Okay, that's barter exchange. There's no money involved. I simply try to exchange these two different goods between two different interested parties. Whenever you have trade, so under a typical monetary transaction, you're going to buy, say, a computer from China. Well, you have to pay the Chinese supplier in a currency that they will accept. Probably they will not accept euros, so you have to exchange euros into another currency that would be accepted by this Chinese seller. So whenever you have let's call it a real transaction, you also have connected to it a monetary transaction. So whenever you're dealing with international transactions, you're typically between countries that do not have the same currency, you always have connected with a real transaction, you always have a money transaction. Now, imagine that the EU prohibited you from selling euros in order to buy the Chinese currency through an exchange control. Now, if you cannot pay the Chinese supplier in a currency they will accept, obviously they will not make the trade. So one way to limit trade is to control the means of paying for those transactions. Capital controls, as we're going to see, are different because capital controls apply to movements of capital, and capital is just the money, the value that is being applied, in international applications. The right to buy shares in a US company, for instance, is a capital movement. Now, capital movements have particularly different macroeconomic impacts, and so they're typically seen as different from the forms of exchange that is connected with real transactions. So there's a distinction between exchange controls and capital controls, as we will see along this part of our program. Okay, so there's something that we can call an international monetary system. International economic law, as you can see here, has really evolved from being, something that was defined by each state, a more anarchical system, one where states really had all the power to control their own currency, into one where states have accepted to limit their monetary sovereignty in specific areas in order to facilitate global trade. And this is obviously something that plays into the agenda of the World Economic Order set up in the Bretton Woods Conference. And it's clear from Article 4, Paragraph 1 of the IMF Articles of Agreement, as you can see, that the goal of having this international monetary system is really to facilitate trade in goods, services, as well as the flow of capital as a factor of production. So the international monetary system plays this ancillary, this supportive role to the international trade and international movements of capital. Now, there's one issue that this raises, and that is there really a neat separation between the international monetary system on the one hand and the international financial system on the other? Now, to understand why this is an issue, you have to think that when we talk about the international monetary system, we're talking about a system where the actors are states, and more specifically, national central banks. In the Eurozone case, obviously, the European Central Bank is the key actor because it's under the rules of the EU, it is the European Central Bank and the European system of central banks that has the task that is in charge of both monetary policy, so interest rates to control inflation, etc., as well as the exchange rate policy. So this is the international monetary system involves sovereign agents, okay, states or their financial representatives, that is to say, central banks. But central banks are also part of the state. So there's this element of sovereignty, of iure imperi behind the international monetary system. When we talk about the international financial system, on the other hand, we're talking about banks, merchant banks, investment banks, etc. So we're talking about non-sovereign entities that operate in international financial markets. Now, if you think of the subprime crisis in 2008, it started about 2008, or the Eurozone crisis, it's very difficult to make a very fine line distinguishing between the international monetary system and international financial system, in the sense that trade will not be affected only by disturbances in the international monetary system. It will also be affected by any disturbances in the very international financial system. So when by 2008, the world banking system was on the verge of a global meltdown, the risk was that you'd have a series of failures of major global financial institutions. The ensuing result would be a major global depression of a much larger extent than the one that actually occurred, because it would have knocked out financial institutions across the globe. So an event such as this means that you cannot simply say, well, banks are a domestic problem. The financial system is also part of the international mission of ensuring a stable monetary system. Now, the problem is that although this is today something that most people would accept, that there's an indelible link between the international monetary system and the international financial system. If you look at the mandate, so the extent of the powers of the IMF, and I point you here to a document you'll have on the webpage. It's an internal document issued by the IMF. It's an overview of the fund's mandate. And as you can see, the mandate of the IMF is limited to official arrangements relating to balance of payments. That is to say, relations between monetary sovereigns, states through their central banks. So official arrangements regarding balance of payments. And it is different from the international financial system. And so it says, well, although it is a valid subject of scrutiny, so obviously there are possible risks to the international monetary system arising from, say, a badly regulated financial system. It is a second-order activity to scrutinize the international financial system. So this is something that, as we're going to see, is the IMF really advocates that it should probably be part of its mandate, but because of the current structure, it views it as something that is secondary to its main focus, which is on the relations between sovereigns, between central banks. And I will say a few more things on that. Okay, so there's a definition of what are international monetary systems. It covers these rules on exchange agreements between countries and the rates at which foreign exchange is purchased and sold. There are many agreements in place between central banks, say, of the United States and the other G7 partners, with many countries that have strong reserves, like Saudi Arabia, etc. Rules on payments, so how states make payments to each other of the balances of their current accounts. It covers arrangements on the regulation of international capital movement, so this is also under the purview of the IMF, and then arrangements as to how reserves are held. As we're going to see, for instance, gold is no longer accepted as an international reserve, so currencies are reserves. Gold, monetary gold, is no longer accepted as one of these. Okay, so to sum up, the international monetary system is public in nature, so it deals only with these official arrangements between members of the IMF. It deals only with international law, with international rules. It is not concerned with domestic rules. And we have this definition issue. International monetary affairs refers to balance of payments. Okay, so As we've seen, the concept of a balance of payments is one of the key economic concepts to understand international economic law. The balance of payments is important because if you have an imbalance, if you say import more than you export with the other trading partners, then you're going to have to finance that deficit somehow. On the other hand, if you have a trade surplus, so if you sell more to other nations than what you import, that is also an imbalance. An imbalance is anything that is off balance. And both deficits and surpluses are by definition situations where things are not balanced. As we're going to see, particularly in this part of our course, a lot of the pressure to remedy these imbalances is put not on the countries that have a surplus, but rather on the countries having a deficit. And that's something that goes back to the history of the IMF, as we're going to see. So this sort of opposition between deficit countries on the one hand and surplus countries on the other. A surplus seems to be good, but if you think of it internationally, if you have a surplus, this means that you could buy more from your partners, and so you should probably increase your money supply so that people will have more money to buy imports, thus reducing the surplus. However, we will see that typically pressure for adjustment is really laid upon states having a trade deficit. But we'll go deeper into that further on. Now, the financial system is both public and private in nature because there's obviously public regulation. It deals with these arrangements between banks, so acting without any iure imperi. It deals with domestic rules, so not international law, but really domestic rules. And it refers to movements of payment, of capital, but not payments. So payments are considered to be a matter of the international monetary system, payments of real transactions, so transactions in goods and services. Movements of capital, on the other hand, are considered to be under the province of the international financial system. So a brief characterization of the current regime that we have is one where we have a very fragmented system, one that Professor Giovannoli, for instance, prefers to talk about an international financial architecture, in the sense that there's no sort of solid structure in place. It's really something that has different types of arrangements, okay? But this would cover all these rules, guidelines, and any other arrangements that would govern international financial relations, as well as the different institutions involved in this field. Another important point, we're going to see there's really a plethora of international institutions and groupings. In addition to the IMF, you have the Bank of International Settlements, the G20, and a very large number of actors active in this area. There's no centralization specifically on the IMF. There's also an important role for cooperation. Cooperation at the executive power level. And here, for instance, I point out the Vassal Committee. The Vassal Committee is a committee that meets under the auspices of the Bank for International Settlements in Basel in Switzerland. But people who take part are members of central banks, so the executive level, not the legislative level. And they establish standards, for instance, international standards that they will then translate into domestic rules for banks. The same goes for securities regulators, so the stock exchange, shares and bonds, etc. There's an organization, International Organization of Securities Commissions, IOSCO, and IOSCO is the forum for this cooperation between these domestic actors. So there's an international network of these domestic administrative entities. There's also the role of non-governmental bodies, particularly with regard to standard setting, and I point out here the International Accounting Standards Committee. A lot of the law that is created in these groups tends to be soft law, and a major example is the Basel Accords. Now, the Basel Accords set a number of things, including so-called prudential ratios. So, for instance, the amount of capital that a bank should have readily available in the event of an emergency, and the composition of the capital that should be available in short term. Now, the more capital reserves a bank is required to have, the less they can leverage. That is to say, multiply the effect of the money that they lend, because obviously they will have less money to lend. Now, one of the problems is if there's excessive leveraging. So if the institution is has a very high multiple of loans outstanding with comparison to the capital reserves it has, if loans start to default, then you're going to lose faith in that institution's ability to be able to pay its liabilities. And so the Basel Accords have defined international standards as to these minimum capital requirements. Now, note that this is not a legislative body. Okay, this is not even a sort of a hard type of international organization. It is a standard-setting body. And what happens is the Basel Accords in themselves are texts of soft law, but then they are implemented in domestic law. So you have EU law, for instance, implementing the Basel Accords with regard to banks in the Eurozone, etc., etc. And finally, there's no clear mandate for the IMF, as we're going to see. So the IMF is sort of tied to its own mission, but it is aware that there are problems, connected to its core business, but it does not really have a clear mandate from members in order to intervene in those areas. And that creates a tension because ultimately there's a sort of a blind spot in terms of international financial rules. Okay, so just a brief view of institutional aspects. So the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 decided on the creation of the IMF. It was created in 1945. Its main legal texts are the Articles of Agreement, so sort of the constitution of the IMF. And it was subject to a very heated debate, particularly between the US and UK delegations. The US position, which largely prevailed, was one that focused the role of the IMF in ensuring both convertibility, that is to say, the ability of currencies to be converted into dollars and then from dollars into gold, and also a sort of economic policies that would preserve the value of money and that would not lead to inflation, that would make countries pay their debts. At the end of World War II, the United States was a major international creditor. It had both wartime loans and post-war loans for economic development to other countries. And so it was a major creditor. And they were concerned that countries, if there was not an effective discipline with regard to international payments, that some countries would default on their commitments. So as a creditor, the United States wanted to make sure, that other countries would be able to pay their debt to the United States. On the other hand, the United Kingdom had emerged from World War II in a much more fragile position. It had large debt, particularly due to the war, of course. The British pound sterling had been sort of the key element of the former gold standard, but the interwar period showed that Britain could no longer sustain a central role in a gold or a gold currency system, and so that was abandoned by the United Kingdom. Now, the United Kingdom's delegation, headed by the famous economist John Maynard Keynes, was very much concerned with making sure that, okay, we need to have international cooperation, we accept that. So this means that we will need to have some international rules, but we're not really going to sacrifice domestic political priorities in order to safeguard these broader international goals. So we need to retain the ability to adopt economic policies domestically that are targeted at ensuring full employment. So if necessary, the state should be able to spend so as to mitigate and overcome the effects of an economic crisis. So this meant less discipline, so more flexibility. And Keynes expressed it in this phrase that really shows that one of the central points of the IMF debate or the Bretton Woods debate. Okay, how much do we leave to, do we set out in rules? How much we're going to set in the letter of the law? And how much are we going to set to be resolved through discretion? That is to say, just setting guidelines or guiding principles, but then not determining the type of outcome or the type of obligation that states would have to incur in. And so that's the key debate, the debate between rules and discretion. And Professor Kenneth Lamb, in his book, The Rules of the Game, he deals with these issues by showing how there's this tension between hard and fast rules on the one hand and discretion on the other. The balance was sort of mixed. There were very strong and hard rules regarding, particularly regarding the exchange rate, but then there was more flexibility in policies of access to the IMF funding and some other policies. With the failure of the Bretton Woods system in 1973, when Nixon pulled out of his convertibility obligation, so the dollar was no longer convertible into gold at a fixed exchange rate. So exchange rates started to fluctuate. And so the system has lived a lot more under a discretion rather than a strict rules type of mindset, so to speak. Okay, so just to sum up, so there was this will to protect the UK on the part of the Keynes of the British delegation, and on the other hand, the White plan, the plan proposed by Harry Dexter White, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, was one that really meant that if you have a trade deficit, then you need to correct that so that you are able to continue to pay for your imports, and the IMF would help, but there would be strings attached. So you would access the resources of the IMF, but there were conditions in order to have access to those resources, and that is also a central part of one of the most controversial areas of the IMF, the so-called conditionality policy. Members can have access to the fund's resources, but they come with terms attached. So if states do not meet those terms, then they may ultimately lose access to these funds, thus leaving them, at the mercy of international financial markets that tend not to be complacent with economic policies. Okay, you have Article 1 of the statutes of the Articles of Agreement provides a number of goals. I will not go through these, but you can see here a multitude of goals. So international monetary cooperation. Again, the idea that stable monetary relations help promote trade and investment and thus economic growth. That we should develop a system where that will eliminate, foreign exchange restrictions, that would limit the world trade, that it would give confidence to world markets. And that's sort of one of the roles it has persisted in throughout these decades. And then finally, to shorten the impact, the duration, and the costs of um, disequilibrium in international balance of payments. Okay, so the sources of law for the IMF are, so the sort of main law is the Articles of Agreement, so the founding treaty. It has been amended several times, as you can see. Then you have the bylaws that were also adopted together with the Articles of Agreement. And then you have a number of acts of unilateral acts of the IMF, so acts of the organs of the IMF. And these are the resolutions of the Board of Governors, decisions of the Executive Board, and also directives of the Managing Director. So all these are acts that are binding upon members of the IMF, and they have to be adopted by the competent organs of the IMF. I'm going to mention some of these acts throughout the course, and I will make those the most important ones available for you on the webpage. Okay, so once you fix the treaty, there's the question, is there enough flexibility to adjust the treaty to new developments? Now, as you can see, although we've had 6 amendments so far, amendment is not easy to achieve. It requires 85% of total votes. As we're going to see, this is not that complicated because votes are really apportioned on the basis of the overall economic importance of each member. There's a reason for that, as we're going to see in the quota system. Then there are other provisions that create flexibility. You have variation powers, Article 5, Paragraph 7, Proviso C, enabling provisions for general exchange arrangements, Article 4, Paragraph 2, Proviso C, the power to emit rules and regulations, Article 12, 2G, and the power to issue guidelines, particularly with regard to surveillance, Article 4, Paragraph 3, Proviso B. We're going to be focusing a lot on these guidelines. Now, as an international organization, it has a legal personality, Article 9. Its siege is in Washington, D.C., together with the World Bank. And so, again, that's why when we talk about Washington Consensus, that also refers to the fact that, they are sieged in Washington. It has a nearly universal membership, but the European Union, for instance, is not a member because it is not a state. So only states may be members of the IMF. The EU takes part in the workings of the IMF as an observer, but it is not a member. Its member states are members of the IMF. Okay, quotas. So quotas are important to understand the nature of the IMF and a lot of the functioning of it as well. So the fund's resources, their sort of basic resources, are the transfers of money made by each member to the IMF. So these are the so-called quotas. Now, the larger your quota, so the more a financial stake you have in the resources of the fund, the more your voting power. Okay, so you have here, just to give you an indication, the US has over 15% of the votes. Then you have a number of other nations. China now at 6.09. If you look at, for instance, Spain, 1.92%, Portugal, 0.44%. So there's, as you can also see in the slide, there's a formula to estimate the amount of the quotas that takes into account the GDP, the openness of the economy. Is it an economy open to international trade? That is to say, what is the share of imports and exports in terms of gross national product? and the economic variability and international reserves. So all these factors are taken into account in determining the quotas. Now, quotas are then denominated, so their value is expressed in SDRs. So SDRs are special drawing rights, and they operate as the IMF unit of account. Before the European Union, for instance, had the euro, we had the so-called ECU, the European Currency Unit, that operated in a manner very similar to the SDRs. You could not, buy ECUs and use ECUs to pay your shopping, but it was this sort of unit of account for EU purposes that was independent of the fluctuations of each member's exchange rates. Now, 5 years ago, the total of quotas, as you can see, was $668 billion. It's a significant amount of money, but when you think of some of the financial challenges the world has had to confront itself with in past decades, and now with the pandemic, it's not really that impressive, as we will see. Okay, so the organs, the bodies of the IMF, the top body, so the most important one, is the so-called Board of Governors. Now, governor is a title that is attributed in many countries to the chair of the National Central Bank. In Portugal, for instance, that's the name. The governor of the Portuguese Central Bank is the chairperson of the Portuguese Central Bank. So the Board of Governors includes one governor. Now, the governor may be the Minister of Finance or the central bank governor, and then one alternate, so a deputy that will also take part in the delegation, one per member. All of the powers of the IMF are vested in the Board of Governors, but since the Board of Governors only meets twice a year, there are these large assemblies of ministers of finance and central bank governors. They take place twice a year, normally in Washington. And these assemblies, they work as both the Board of Governors of the IMF as well as the Board of Governors of the World Bank. So there's a sort of a mixed assembly for both. They use different hats, of course, in the sense that once they're meeting as the Board of Governors or as the World Bank Assembly. But so there's this idea, this fiction that all of these powers belong to the Board of Governors. Now, this marks the essentially intergovernmental nature of the IMF, in the sense that if all the powers are lodged with the Board of Governors, all powers really should be exercised by representatives of member states of the IMF. Because it only meets twice, then this fiction sort of is dissolved in the fact that while the Board of Governors is not convened, then all these powers are then delegated to the Executive Board. So the Executive Board is really in charge of the more day-to-day management of the fund. Again, we have particularities in how this Executive Board is composed. As you can see, so 24 executive directors. It is chaired by the managing director, sort of the face of the IMF. The appointment of executive directors is divided into sort of two blocks. The first one is the members with the largest quotas have the right to appoint one director each. The remaining 16 directors are then elected by members in constituency groups. So these mix countries from, say, developing countries and developed countries, so as to create groups of approximately the same type of representativeness. So there are two. When you think of the executive directors, this creates this dual nature problem. that, are they really representatives of the appointing or elective members, or are they also fund officials? Well, in reality, they're both. So they're both representing either the country that appointed them, the member that appointed them, or the constituency, so the set of countries that was that had the power to appoint that specific director. But they also have an allegiance to the fund. They're fund officials, so they're not strictly speaking representatives of the states, in the sense that they would only carry out the instructions of their appointing or electing constituency. So this is a photograph of a meeting of the executive board a few years ago, and so here you have how things were before the pandemic, at least. Now, the managing director, as I said, is the face of the IMF. It is appointed under a rule of consensus by the executive board, and it is historically, it has been traditionally a post held by an European, currently Bulgarian national, Kristalina Georgieva. They have 5-year terms, so there will be a new term beginning at the end of this year. The executive director is supported by a team of deputy managing directors. So they are more responsible for the different administrative functions. And the articles of agreement specify that the executive director is the chief of the operating staff of the fund, so the highest figure in the staff of the fund, and he or she conducts under the direction of the executive board, conducts the ordinary business of the fund, and is responsible for the organization, for the appointment and dismissal of the staff. Now, the staff is now approximately 2,700 people from 148 countries, so trying to ensure diversity and representativeness of the different members and the different economic development and policies of its members. Okay, there are a number of other bodies in the IMF, particularly the committees. I've posted on the webpage sort of what I call a survival guide to these committees, because there are a lot of them, and so you can go through it, and it's an IMF publication that gives you some detail into the role and how these committees are organized. I just underline here the IMFSC, because you're going to read about this committee. And as you can see, the IMFC was created particularly following the financial crisis earlier this century, in order to try and bring some coherence between the monetary system and the financial system. And as you can see, also to promote some more strategic approach by both the board of governors and the executive board. Also, the composition is the same as the executive board, so the division in terms of members follows the same lines, but it has no decision-making powers. It's merely an advisory committee, and its decisions are typically taken on the basis of consensus. Consensus, we're going to see, plays a key role in international economic organizations. Consensus means that no one objects. A decision is only adopted if no one objects. Okay, so that's what we typically view as consensus. So it's not like unanimity. With unanimity, everyone has to vote in favor. In consensus, you may have no position to express, but as long as you do not express opposition, a decision may be taken by consensus. So there's no need for you to, say, yes, I agree. If you say nothing, the decision is adopted by consensus. Then the development committee, obviously very important in terms of its function of promoting development goals in the functioning of the IMF. and then the Independent Evaluation Office. This is an independent office. It was created in the beginning of this century, um, and it's an important one because it looks at the fund's work and policies, and it makes comments and recommendations. It's not it's not an accounting sort of accounting um, supervisory body in terms of the financial regularity of payments. Okay, that's not its mandate. Its mandate is really to look at the fund's policies, and particularly as we're going to see, when the fund lends resources and then imposes conditions in order for states to have access to those resources, those conditions will typically involve recommendations of particular policies, economic policies. And a lot of those policies were heavily criticized by countries that had to resort to the IMF. So the idea behind this independent evaluation office is to have people that are detached from the intervention itself. So people that will not be biased because they were involved in granting the loans and negotiating the terms and conditions, but people who are detached from it and that may carry an independent assessment. Were the goals adequate to solve the crisis of payments? Were the policies effective? Did they, for instance, increase inequality between different groups of the population? Did they lead to underfunding of basic social services? Okay, so that type of thing. So it is an important one in ensuring, that the fund is more responsive to this criticism that it only has this sort of very Washington-based, Washington consensus-based policy of privatization, liberalization, abolishing price controls, etc., etc. Okay, so on decision making, as I said, the basis is consensus. So all the organs tend to operate on this basis of consensus. Now, you might think, well, if things work on the basis of consensus, then this may hinder the good functioning of this of the IMF. Say if we weren't in a pandemic and we all decided that we're going to have dinner, to celebrate spring, it would probably be difficult to find a consensus as to where and on which date we should have our dinner. The thing is, when we talk about these international organizations, the consensus approach is one that is really relevant because, unlike, say, the EU as instruments to make sure that its laws are applied, and even there's margin for discussion. But when we talk about these large international organizations, compliance, that is to say, effective application of the rules and disciplines, really depends on self-compliance by states. So it's not very useful to adopt a policy that faces opposition, because what you're going to have then is resistance to that policy. And that resistance will undermine sort of the unified effort of the organization. So particularly in areas where states do have a lot of discretion, consensus tends to be sort of the basic rule of operation. And so we're going to see the consensus approach also in the area of trade, as we're going to see in part 3 of our course. So I'm not saying that consensus is ideal. I'm just saying, consensus does have some advantages, but obviously you cannot deny the disadvantages that are, blockages are very easy to create. All it takes is for one member to say, I object, and, other states will then try to persuade them to, waiver their objections. So it lends itself more to a more diplomatic sort of approach in terms of the functioning of these of these organs. So, for instance, in the executive, now obviously, if you had to vote everything, this would create tension. So what happens is, and I give you here the example, is the general practice in a number of bodies, including, say, the academic council and the scientific council at the University of Lisbon Law School. They operate under the same rule, which is the so-called sense of the meeting. So there's a discussion, and then the chairperson, sums up and says, okay, so I think that there's a consensus that, our decision is this, or our position on this topic is this. And if no one objects, then, it's the sense of the meeting. And so the chairperson will call it a consensus. Okay. Any member, however, may require that a vote be held. Trying to admit someone here. Now, just as in quotas, as we've seen, so quotas are vary depending on the economic importance of a country and its GDP and its openness to international trade. But then votes are granted in alignment with quotas. So, that proportion of the quotas that we saw equals the proportion of votes. So if you think, for instance, of the United States, the United States, if you have a decision that requires, say, 80%, the United States with, say, Germany would be, or with China, would be in a position to block any decision. So whenever we vote, we have votes, then we have this problem that, the most important members, the ones with larger quotas, have the overwhelming majority of the votes. Now, if we look back to what we saw in the beginning of the course, in the very first lectures, I talked about the principle of sovereign equality. Now, how is this compatible with sovereign equality? If members have a different amount of votes according to the importance of their quota. Well, there was an attempt to reform rules in 2010 through this equal division of a small percentage of the aggregate sum of total voting power. But even with this equal division, it's still a less egalitarian system than it was originally in 1945. That is to say, in 1945, so-called basic votes, so votes that were distributed, allocated equally among IMF members, corresponded to 11.3%. Now, votes that are attributed on an equal basis to all members are only 5.5%, so less than half what it was in 1945. So these are the rules, of course, but there's always been a lot of pressure, particularly from developing countries, saying, we're clearly underrepresented in these decisions. So the truth is that, the IMF operates as a financial club, and so, members that contribute more to the club obviously have a bigger saying than the others. And so that's part of the condition for, allocating resources to the fund. Okay, so one of the possible sanctions within the IMF is the suspension of voting rights. So if a member fails to fulfill its obligations, for instance, if it breaches rules on the use of resources, then their voting may be suspended. And finally, you have different majority rules depending on the object of the decision. So as a rule, decisions are taken by a majority of votes cast, but then in important decisions, for instance, a change in quotas, that could dilute the vote of a member, you have an 85% qualified majority requirement. Now, note that since the United States has over 16% of votes, the United States is single-handedly able to block any decision on quotas. Okay, then operational decisions have a qualified majority of 70%. For instance, changing the charges that are applied to members for access to the fund's resources. So again, the United States, with a few more of the rich countries, is in a position to collectively block these decisions. Now, this rule of weighted voting is then carried on to the executive directors. So each executive directors will represent the voting power of the member that appointed it. So the United States representative will have the 16-point-something% of votes of the United States. And then a member that is a director that is elected by a constituency will have as many votes as the sum total of the states that form part of the constituency that elected him or her. So it's a system that tends to replicate the power structure of in the IMF. Okay, sorry, just accidentally paused this. All right. Now, as I said, there's no dispute settlement. So what we have is so-called interpretation. Now, under the agreement between the UN and the IMF, 1947, which affiliates the IMF with the United Nations, the International Court of Justice may be called upon to issue advisory opinions. And this is the type of advisory jurisdiction that the International Court of Justice has exercised in the past. It has never been used with regard to the IMF, by the way. So, interpretation. Well, interpretation may be formal or informal. So, when you have a question regarding, say, the powers of the fund or whether a specific policy is consistent with the fund's objectives, rather than have a dispute between two members or a dispute between a member and the IMF's organs, what you have is a question. Now, the question will then be submitted to the executive board, and the executive board will then consider and decide this question. Now, here it will be considered by the Committee on Interpretation on a one member, one vote principle. But then the Board of Governors has to accept, to adopt that interpretation. And here they may veto the decision with an 85% majority. However, the Committee on Interpretation has not been created, so this means that Article 29 is still in the hands of the Executive Board. Now, informally, most of the decisions taken by the IMF following the First Amendment in 1969 have taken this route of Article 29, Proviso A. All these interpretations are binding on members, and obviously, who is responsible for making these interpretations? Well, the very staff of the IMF, particularly the legal staff. So, being on the legal staff of the IMF is a position of tremendous power and responsibility, because ultimately they are the ones that are going to discuss internally how to settle that question. Now, because we're talking about an international organization and the staff is independent of members, interpretation tends to follow a teleological approach. That is to say, one that seeks to maximize the impact of the IMF's powers. So a teleological approach sort of meets that purpose. Okay, so how do we ensure compliance? Well, the IMF has a lot of power simply because it has the power to make a member, to reject a member's access to the fund. Um, Now, this means that since the fund's main power is the power to withhold funds, so a member asks for the fund's assistance and the fund says no, or they impose very strict conditions for that member to access the fund, then compliance is really very one-sided in the sense that if you are a member that needs to resort to the fund's resources, or if it's realistic to envisage that in the future they are going to be in a position where they will ask for access to these resources, then the IMF has a lot of leverage on you. They can exercise a lot of power in making sure that you comply because you need access to the fund. On the other hand, if you're a major country like the United States, most of the developed countries have not resorted to the IMF. There were a few exceptions by the end of the late 60s. The United Kingdom, for instance, resorted to the IMF, and also in the Euro crisis, where several European countries had to resort also to the IMF. But typically, developed countries, if you think of Germany or the United States or even Japan, it's very unlikely that they will ever be, at least in the predictable future, that they will be in a position where they will need to come with their hands held, asking for funds resources. So that's why I talk here about an implicit bias, because if the main pressure to ensure compliance is if you do not comply with IMF law, we will not lend you money, then you only have leverage over those who might depend on those loans. But developed countries that are not likely to need access to the fund's resources then do not have a lot of incentives to make sure that they comply with IMF's recommendations. And going back to the financial crisis of 2008, one of the problems was a very lax supervision, so not effective supervision, very permissive supervision by the United States Federal Reserve System on how US banks were operating. And because of that, bad supervision or inefficient or insufficient supervision, the whole world was confronted with a major financial crisis, one that also threatened trade. So, it seems a bit distorted that, the IMF only really has power. So if you need access to the fund, then, there's a lot of pressure on you to comply with the IMF. But if you don't need the money of the fund, then, compliance is sort of something that is good to avoid peer pressure, to avoid economists, etc., writing bad things about your economic policies, but ultimately it does not really have that much power on you. Okay, so there's this bias that you should consider when you think about the role of the IMF. Okay, so just a final slide just to show you the various groups that we have. And when we start with the tutorial classes, we'll probably be given an assignment on some of these. So there's, as I said, there's a great variety of different organizations, and they all play a role in the international monetary and financial affairs. Some I've already mentioned, the G7 I've already mentioned, the G20, which is a group, a more representative group of developed and developing countries. The Paris Club is the club of international creditors. So international creditor states have this club, and it has important actions, for instance, with regard to debt reduction and debt pardons, particularly to least developed countries. And then the G10, that, as we will see, plays a role in ensuring additional funds to be made available to the IMF in the event of the funds resources being insufficient to cope with an international crisis.